World War One started on July 4th, 1914, and ended over 4 years later on November 11th, 1918. The war was fought between two key alliances in Europe, Great Britain, France, and Russia, together called the Triple Entente, fought against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, who were known as the Central Powers. The war claimed roughly 20 million lives and was fought mainly on two fronts, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The battles were dominated by trench warfare and saw the use of new weapons, such as machine guns, tanks, poison gas, aircraft, and submarines. In this video, we will explore the key battles of the Western Front and how they tell the story of a war that changed history forever. This is World War One: Path to Victory. In 1905, Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff, proposed a plan that was designed to allow Germany to fight a war against both France on the Western Front and Russia on the Eastern Front simultaneously. The plan was heavily modified by Schlieffen's successor, Helmuth von Moltke, prior to and during its implementation in World War I. The core idea was to defeat France within 6 weeks, using Germany's full force, then redeploy troops against Russia. The Germans estimated that Russia would be slow to mobilize, since their rail networks were poor and their army was less modernized. The Russians had also shown poor logistics in recent conflicts. The Germans believed they could defeat France by going through Belgium and attacking France from the north, as well as their direct border with Germany. They believed they could outflank the French military, eventually surrounding them into surrender. And so, when Germany invaded Belgium on the 4th of August 1914, the first major battle of the war happened, which was known as the Battle of Liege. The Battle of Liege was the first major battle of the war. The Germans expected little resistance from Belgium and believed they could pass through within 2 days. Remember, the Schlieffen Plan was all about defeating France quickly. However, much to their surprise, the Belgians put up a lot of resistance, and thus the battle began. Liege was a fortified city in eastern Belgium, near the German border. The city had 12 forts. They were designed to form a ring around Liege, and each fort had armored gun turrets, thick concrete walls, and was garrisoned with hundreds of men. The Belgians had a force of around 35,000 troops. The Germans approached with double the number, between 60 to 100,000 men. Even though the Belgians were outnumbered, they inflicted many German casualties during the first days of the war. They used machine guns and artillery effectively behind the forts. However, the Germans eventually brought in their own heavy artillery, a howitzer called Big Bertha. These were massive siege weapons, weighing over 40 tons. They could fire shells weighing 1,000 kilograms over distances of 9 to 12 kilometers. They used 2 of these guns to eventually destroy most of the 12 forts. The fort of Lonsin was famously obliterated in a single massive explosion from the Big Bertha gun, killing around 350 defenders. Most of these forts are still in ruins today from the battle. After 10 days of fighting, the Belgians eventually surrendered. Germany captured Liege on the 16th of August 1914. Even though Germany was victorious, they lost a lot of time in the battle, which gave Britain, France and Russia time to mobilize. After Germany had defeated Belgium, the second major battle took place. It was actually 5 major battles that happened across the France-German border and the Belgium-France border. Germany were enacting the Schlieffen Plan, aiming to swiftly defeat France by attacking them on 2 fronts. with the objective to then circle onto Paris. They believed this could be achieved in 6 weeks. France had launched their own attack, which was called Plan 17. Their goal was to recapture Alsace-Lorraine. This was a region that was lost to the Germans in an earlier war in 1871. By this time, the British Expeditionary Force had arrived in France, which was around 80,000 men. Overall, the Battle of the Frontiers was a German success. The French were forced to retreat after a series of defeats, and so too would the British Expeditionary Force. On the 22nd of August 1914, the French witnessed the bloodiest day in their military history, losing over 27,000 soldiers in one day. In total, the French had lost roughly 260,000 soldiers, Germany had lost around 200,000, and the British had lost an estimated 13,000 troops. The Germans gained much ground and advanced deep into France. By early September of 1914, they were just 50 miles from Paris. A German victory was close, and German morale was high. The Germans had advanced deep into France and were closing in on Paris. The French and the British had been forced back to the River Marne. However, the Germans had marched hundreds of miles through Belgium and France and had overextended their supply lines. This meant food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, reinforcements, and communication were taking longer to arrive to the front line from the German bases. Also, at this point, the Russians had mobilized and began their attack in the east. The Germans had to divert troops to the eastern front to hold the Russians. The original Schlieffen Plan was to send a strong right-wing army to attack France from the west, while the left-wing army was to hold the line at the France-Germany border. However, due to overextended supply lines and less available troops due to the Russian attack on the eastern front, the plan was changed. The right-wing army now approached Paris from the east and northeast of Paris. Due to miscommunication and lack of supplies, a gap formed between the right-wing German armies. The French and the British recognized this gap and saw an opportunity to counterattack at the Marne River to exploit this gap. They attacked the German forces at each open flank of their armies. This caught the Germans by surprise, and they were forced to retreat and abandon their plan to encircle Paris. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Over 2 million soldiers fought in this battle, with both sides suffering around 250,000 casualties. The First Battle of the Marne was a key turning point in the war. Once the German advance was stopped, and both sides realized neither could easily break through the other's lines, they began digging in to hold their ground. Within days and weeks after the First Battle of the Marne, armies started constructing trenches, dugouts, barbed wire defences, and machine gun nests. This process was rapid and widespread, stretching the front line into a long, continuous network of trenches from the North Sea coast through Belgium and northeastern France, all the way to the Swiss border. This marked the beginning of what was called the Race to the Sea, as both sides extended their trench lines northward, trying to outflank each other, but ultimately locking into a continuous front. Much of 1915 on the Western Front was spent in trench warfare, with mass casualties but no real breakthroughs from either side. It became apparent that this was going to be a war of attrition, meaning one side was aiming to wear the other side down over time. German General Erich von Falkenhayn believed the war could be won or lost in France. He wrote a letter to the German Emperor William II in late 1915, stating that Germany did not need a huge breakthrough, but could bleed France to death by choosing a point of attack that was of psychological importance to the French, such that they would send every troop to defend it. The fortress at Verdun was a symbol of military national pride for France, and was selected as the target because of its symbolism. Von Falkenhayn was convinced that if Verdun fell, then French morale would be destroyed and France could be defeated. Verdun consisted of 19 major forts, but with German artillery success against the Belgian forts, von Falkenhayn was confident that they could break through them. On the 21st of February 1916, the Germans launched a massive bombardment of a 25-mile front. In 4 days, the Germans captured Fort Douaumont, the largest fort of Verdun. The fighting continued, and the Germans made more gains by capturing Fort Fox in June. At this point, momentum was in Germany's favour, but came at cost since both sides were equally losing thousands of troops. On the 1st of July 1916, the British launched an offensive at the Somme River. They wanted to split the German army to relieve pressure at Verdun. This marked the turning point in the battle. The Germans attempted to seize Fort Souville but failed. The French counterattacked and by October had reclaimed Fort Douaumont and a week later recaptured Fort Fox. The French were now gaining morale and momentum. The French continued their counterattack, and by December the French had recaptured nearly all territory it had lost that year. And so, after 10 months of fighting, the French held Verdun, but the cost was high. It's estimated that each side lost roughly 150,000 soldiers, bringing the total loss of life for this battle at roughly 300,000 people, which was an average of over 1,000 deaths per day, every day, for 10 months. This was the longest battle of World War I. Britain and France had agreed to launch a major joint offensive in summer 1916 at the Somme River region. The goal was to break German lines and relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. Britain had been mainly defensive during 1915, so this was the first major offence they had planned. The French had their hands full at Verdun, so could not contribute many troops at the Somme, so this ended up being a British-led assault. The opposing trenches were separated by an open, unoccupied area around 100 to 300 meters wide. This area was known as No Man's Land, which was filled with barbed wire, landmines, and traps. This area was exposed to machine guns, snipers, and artillery. Entering this area in daylight meant an almost certain death. Soldiers claimed it was very eerie and silent at night, with the smell of death in the air and the moaning sounds of wounding soldiers being heard. On the 24th of June 1916, the British launched a 7-day artillery bombardment against the German trenches, firing over 1.5 million shells. They aimed to destroy the German barbed wire, flatten the trench systems, and kill the defenders. This would then pave the way for their infantry to advance with little resistance, at least so they thought. However, half of the shells fired were duds. They did not explode. The British underestimated the depths of the German trenches, which went 30 plus feet underground. As a result, many Germans survived the shelling. On July 1st, 1915, the British artillery stopped firing at around 7:30 am. A few moments later, thousands of troops went over the top, across no man's land, to the German trenches. To their horror, the Germans were still well organized, prepared, and used concentrated machine gun fire to mow down the advancing British army. Over 19,000 British soldiers were killed that day, marking the worst day in British military history. The battle continued for a further 4 months. The British Army were the first military in the world to launch tanks into warfare during this battle. They could withstand rifles and machine gun fire, but were vulnerable to artillery. The tanks proved ineffective. They often broke down or got stuck in the muddy terrain. The battle ended in November 1916 due to exhaustion from both sides. There was no major breakthrough on either side here, similar to Verdun. This was the bloodiest battle of World War I, with over 1 million casualties from both sides. The war was entering its third year in 1917. Trench warfare continued to dominate the Western Front, with very little gains made from either side. Britain, being an island country, relied heavily on food and resources coming in from overseas, with around 60% of their food supply coming from abroad. As part of the German strategy against Britain, they used submarines called U-boats to sink merchant and passenger ships to try and starve Britain out of the war. They also targeted passenger ships because many of these liners were actually carrying weapons and supplies to Britain, so even though they looked civilian on the surface, they actually had a military use. On the 7th of May 1915, a German submarine attacked and destroyed a civilian ship called the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. There was huge international public outrage against Germany for this action, especially in America. Germany claimed the Lusitania was carrying weapons as well as civilians, so this justified their attack. However, public opinion began to turn in America, who had remained neutral since the start of the war. Germany did not want the US to enter the war, so they backed down from submarine warfare until 1917. After several years of a stalemate battle, all sides were drained of resources and morale and were becoming desperate for a breakthrough. Germany was about to restart their naval attacks. They knew this could risk bringing the US into the war, but they believed by that time Britain would surrender. In January 1917, a secret message from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, was intercepted by the British. It proposed that if the US entered the war, then Mexico should attack the US, and in return, Germany would help it recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The British handed the telegram to the US President at the time, Woodrow Wilson. Germany believed they could force Britain to surrender if they continued their attack on their naval supply lines, so they reinstated full unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, and it was successful to begin with. Britain was losing a quarter of their supplies because of German U-boats, but civilian ships were continually being targeted, leading to more American civilians being killed. In March 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was made public to the world and consolidated American opinion against the Germans. In April 1917, America officially joined the war against Germany. Russia, on the other hand, had suffered massive defeats in many of the early war battles. By 1917, the Russian army was poorly equipped, demoralized, and plagued by mutinies and desertions of soldiers. Millions of Russians were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Soldiers were being sent to the front lines without rifles, and were told to pick them up from fallen comrades. Their economy was also breaking down, with bread riots and strikes across the country and inflation making wages worthless. The Russian king, Tsar Nicholas II, had taken control of the army in 1915 and was blamed for their military failure. In March 1917, protests in Russia exploded into a revolution, with the military joining the protesters. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March 15, 1917, and a provisional government took over, but it kept Russia in the war, fearing shame and collapse if they withdrew. This provisional government eventually lost support as well, and a second revolution was born in late October 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, which overthrew the government. In March 1918, Russia signed a peace treaty with Germany, ending the war on the Eastern Front. Germany gained huge territories, like Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltics. Germany had defeated Russia. They could now move over 50 military divisions from the Eastern Front to help in the final battle on the Western Front. With Russia defeated and the Americans yet to arrive in huge numbers, Germany had a window to win the war, since they could now divert all troops to fight France and Britain on the Western Front. Instead of traditional mass infantry assaults, which had repeatedly failed, Germany began using stormtrooper tactics. Stormtroopers were small groups of 6 to 10 elite soldiers that moved quickly and silently. They targeted poorly defended areas in the enemy line and disrupted communication centers, machine gun nests, and command posts. Germany launched Operation Michael on March 21, 1918. They targeted British lines at the Somme. They used artillery bombardment followed by stormtrooper tactics with great success, gaining up to 40 miles in new territory. This was Germany's deepest advance since 1914. Further advances were made by the Germans in the following months over a further 4 battles. They had gained a lot of new ground, but supplies could not keep up with the advances. The Germans had scattered victories but no unified objective. They had hoped that these victories would be enough to force France or Britain to surrender before the Americans arrived in numbers, but time was running out. Germany's 1918 spring offensive was a final roll of the dice, but while the generals agreed on the need to win quickly, they could not agree on how. Instead of one knockout blow, they launched 5 scattered offensives, and though each struck hard, none struck deep enough to force a surrender. Again, the human cost was significant, with both sides suffering casualties up to 800,000 people each. American troops had already begun arriving in France in early 1918. By March 1918, 300,000 US troops were stationed in France. In June, it was 600,000, and by July, a further 10,000 were arriving daily. Germany's window to win the war was closing fast. Germany had gained ground in the spring offensive, but had still failed to break through Allied lines. In July 1918, they tried one last offensive. They planned to attack across the Marne River in 2 main sectors. The goal was to split the French lines, force Britain and France to pull troops away from the north, so that a path to Paris could be opened. However, Britain and France had broken German communication codes, so they knew the attack was coming, and by July, American forces were present in large numbers on the front line. On July 15, 1918, Germany launched their attack, but Britain, France and the USA, known as the Allies, were well prepared and defended the line. On July 18, 1918, the Allied forces launched a counter-offensive with a massive force of 250,000 troops, striking with tanks, aircraft and artillery. Germany was caught off guard and were forced to retreat from the Marne. The Allies pushed them all the way back 40 miles, which meant Germany had lost all the ground it had gained in the spring offensive. This marked the final turning point in the war. Germany was now on the brink of defeat. Germany sustained around 170,000 casualties, whilst the Allied numbers were roughly 120,000. On the 8th of August 1918, the Allied forces of Britain, France, the USA, and troops from Canada and Australia launched a coordinated attack, with all infantry, tanks, and aircraft moving as one. This was the first time this strategy was used in warfare, and was highly effective at disrupting the German trenches. In just one day, Germany suffered 27,000 casualties, including 12,000 prisoners taken. The German general, Erich Ludendorff, called this the Black Day of the German army. This was similar to what happened with the British on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. In just a matter of days, masses of German armies surrendered, something that had never happened before. Germany ordered a full retreat to its Hindenburg Line, which was Germany's strongest defense system. On the 26th of September, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began, which was led by US and French forces. The Americans played a central role, and was the largest battle in US military history up to that point. Within 2 weeks, the Allies had broken through the German lines again. The Allied forces sustained 1.2 million casualties, including those killed, wounded, or missing. Germany had suffered 785,000 casualties, with 400,000 of those taken prisoner. It was clear that the war was lost. Germany military leaders informed Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany was defeated. In the months of October and November, rebellion broke out across Germany, which included sailors, soldiers, and workers. On the 9th of November 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. 2 days later, on the 11th of November 1918, the armistice was signed at 11 a.m., bringing an end to World War I. To summarize, the key battles of World War I on the Western Front began with the Battle of Liege, Belgium, in early August 1914. Germany were enacting the Schlieffen Plan, which was to defeat France in 6 weeks with the full force of their military, and then attack Russia on the Eastern Front, since they would be slow to mobilize. Germany were met with unexpected resistance in Belgium. They expected to pass through within 2 days, but it took them 10. This gave the Allied forces of Britain, France, and Russia time to mobilize. Then came the Battle of Frontiers in late August, with France attempting their own offensive to reclaim the land of Alsace-Lorraine, which was lost to the Germans in 1871. This failed miserably, marking the worst day in French military history, losing 27,000 troops in a single day. The Germans advanced deep into France and were just 50 miles outside Paris. The Schlieffen Plan was going as expected. Next was the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. As German forces neared Paris, the Allies struck back, exploiting a fatal gap in the German line. The Germans retreated, and the Western Front froze into trenches. The war of movement had ended. After a stalemate of trench warfare during 1915, next came the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Germany tried to bleed France white. The French held out at immense cost. Verdun became a symbol of endurance. In July 1916, the British launched their first major offensive at the Battle of the Somme, which saw 60,000 casualties in its first day, the worst in British military history. The battle dragged on with minimal gains, and tanks made their debut. In 1917, after years of neutrality, German submarine attacks on civilian ships and the Zimmermann telegram brought America into the war. Its vast manpower and industry shifted the balance. By March 1918, revolution was tearing Russia apart. The Bolsheviks seized power and signed a peace treaty with Germany, ending the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans had a limited window before the Americans arrived in numbers. They moved all 50-plus divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front for the German Spring Offensive in 1918. They gained 40 miles of land, but their attacks were not coordinated. In July 1918, Germany's final offensive failed. The Allies, reinforced by fresh American troops, counterattacked. German forces were driven back and would never advance again. With tanks, aircraft, and relentless attacks, the Allies broke through German lines again and again. German morale collapsed, and on November 11th, 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice. The war was over. What began with empires marching to glory ended in ruins, revolutions, and mass graves.